Introduce the next speaker, and the next two honor scholars to be have their thesis projects related to a field known as psychology and religion. When I was in graduate school in Berkeley, I'd say about 80% of the dissertation topics were related to two fields, global Christianity and psychology and religion. And for that reason, a lot of doctoral students incorporated, say, trauma theory, psychoanalytic theory, and other psychological insights into their work. Now, I was very insistent that I was doing systematic theology, historical theology, and theological ethics. So I conscientiously avoided the psychology courses. But as some theologians have said, God has a better story to tell. World Christianity came to me a year ago, and through Heaven and Jasmine, psychology found its way to me. However, in the course of helping them think through their theses, I found out why so many theologians find psychological methods to be helpful. Now, in the past 2 years of working with Heaven, I have found her to be someone who cares deeply about faith and also the well-being of others. And this is apparent all the way back to Honors 1120, and is also why her topic is about one's relationship with God. But Heaven does something that few others have done. A lot of work has been done about how one's relationship with God shapes the practice of therapy. But what about the other way around? That is, how can a proper and professional therapist-client relationship inform how one's relationship with God should be? That was fascinating, and that was what interested me about her project. And as she continued to wrestle with the connections, I cannot help but think about how valuable her work is and will continue to be, especially as churches wrestle with sexual harassment and abuse, spiritual abuse, and other troubling habits by leaders, of which I will not name. So without further ado, I pass the mic over to Heaven with a secure relationship with God. Oh, you do this. Here and there we go. Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Dr. Ko, for that very nice introduction. So the full title of my project is A Secure Relationship with God. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Client-therapist relationships as a model for individuals' relationships with God. So to start explaining this topic, I thought the best place to start would be what is attachment theory and what are the four attachment styles themselves. So attachment styles and attachment theory come from the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, and they completed this work in around the 40s and 50s. So the first question I think that can answer what is attachment theory and what are the attachment styles is what is attachment just in general? And basically, in simple terms, it's the emotional bond between infant and caregiver that is formed in that very early stage of life. So secondly, then, what creates the attachment styles? And these hinge completely on whether the infant's needs were properly met during that early childhood period by that caregiver. And so then each of these four attachment styles are based on the level of which that those needs were met by the caregiver. So it reflects the reliability of that caregiver, essentially. And our attachment style is really important because it's believed to follow us throughout our whole life and serve as like a blueprint for how we interact with others and how we form our close bonds throughout the rest of our life. So as you can see in this graphic that I have here, the four attachment styles are listed. So the first is the secure attachment style, which is the ideal attachment style. And a person with this attachment style can be described as self-assured, direct, and responsive. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what type of parent can create each attachment style, because I feel like when you know that, you're able to understand a little better. So for the secure attachment style, the parent was present and reliably met the infant's needs. The second one here is the preoccupied, and you'll see here in my notes, they have a couple names for the three insecure attachment styles. So they call it preoccupied or also the anxious attachment style. So a person with this attachment style is often self-doubting, anxious, and sensitive, like the graphic says here. And the type of parent that forms this attachment style is one that did meet the child's needs, but not consistently. So the child never knew when they were going to have their needs met and when they were not. So then the third attachment style is dismissive, or also known as the avoidant attachment style. And this type of person might seem self-reliant, avoidant, and distant. So the type of parent that can create this attachment style is one that just across the board was insufficiently meeting the infant's needs. So, and even going on into childhood, the child had, either a lot of time alone or had to figure out things on their own a lot more than would have been ideal. And then lastly is the fearful attachment style, which is also known as disorganized, or also known as anxious avoidant. This is the most extreme attachment style, and also the hardest one to treat. So the type of parent that creates this attachment style is pretty erratic. You'll find this attachment style in children who had a traumatic childhood, or their parents were abusive towards them, or something of that sort. So that third question there at the top is, what is a secure base? And this is also really important to know to understand attachment theory fully and to understand the role of that caregiver. So the caregiver serves as what Ainsworth and Bowlby call a secure base. And basically that just means that it's a safe place for the infant to explore the world from, giving them confidence, but also the reassurance to know that if something were to go awry, that their caregiver is reliably going to be there for them to come back and get that reassurance. So first, I wanted to talk about how attachment can relate to the individual-God relationship itself. There's a man named by the name of Lee A. Kirkpatrick, and he has done a lot of work on this. Basically, his goal was to prove that God could serve as an attachment figure in the same way that a father or a later in life romantic partner or close friend could. And I think he did that really well. And it makes a lot of sense considering that in the Bible, a lot of times God is described with these words like father, leader, friend. Like, it makes sense that he would have the capability to also be a key attachment figure. And something else related to attachment and God is that our attachment styles can actually impact how we view God. So first, with the secure one, the ideal one, of course, this person, is able to actively seek God and trust that God's going to meet their needs, or if not meet them, provide them with the emotional support that's needed to get through the trial. And they are seeking that healthy connection. So going down the list with the dismissive or avoidant style, this person across the board can usually be seen as not being as affectionate. So they will also carry that over with God. They're unfamiliar with that affection. They may see God more as an intellectual thing rather than a relational thing. And a lot of times they won't value a relationship with God at all because of that attachment style. Thirdly is the preoccupied or anxious style. So these ones tend to be pretty, I like to describe it as hot and cold. Like, a lot of times you'll find they have a really deep desire to have a relationship with God, but also a really deep-rooted fear of God meeting their needs or accepting them, or that sort. So you will find that they, draw really near to God for a period of time, but then, they'll draw away, they're mistake, or they become afraid, and it's kind of a back and forth, back and forth. It's a very intense relationship, I would assume. And then lastly is the fearful or disorganized, which sees God as being unpredictable, abusive maybe, scary, and this could be the hardest one to try to broach a relationship with God if you have this attachment style. So I also wanted to talk about how attachment can show up in the client therapist relationship and just like in therapy sessions in general. So what can attachment look like in session? The first thing is modeling secure attachment in session. So what I mean by this is the therapist can essentially, like I say here, makeshift secure base. They can become that makeshift secure base that the parent ideally would have been, or the caregiver at the beginning of childhood. Just like modeling that to get the client familiar with what it feels like to have someone who you can rely on, have your needs met, and gain confidence that way. And the way that works is like where with an infant, you know, they may actually be exploring the physical world and they can go back to their caregiver as like that reassurance. Here, I guess it's oftentimes a little more metaphorical where the client is making their way through more emotional or, you know, relational aspects, but they have that therapist as that secure base to come back from. And the therapist can also help the client recognize that those healthy attachment behaviors, which kind of leads into the second one, the awareness of unhealthy attachment. So in therapy, while assessing the client's other, you know, outside relationships, the therapist can help identify like, hey, maybe that's not the most healthy like attachment behavior that you have with this, and it can help the client move towards a healthier place, help their relationship move towards a healthier place, etc. So here is where the meat of my thesis is. Dr. Poe mentioned how these relationships can inform one another. So I'm going to start first with how the individual God relationship informs the client-therapist relationship, because that one's more researched and more talked about, and it makes a lot of sense that it is, because if you think like back through history, how big of a role God and religions played, like people, the art is so religious and the music is so religious, and people's the way their homes were built had altars or places to pray. Like it makes a lot of sense that human kind has this natural inclination to incorporate their God or their religion, whatever it be, even though I'm specifically talking about Christianity here, into all the rest of their life. Like it seems to be a common thing that people want to do. So it makes sense that they carried it over to the field of psychology here. So there's that natural inclination. Then clients' personal religions may also shape how they process things in session, you know, whether that's the things they bring up, the situations they end up in, or even just like their values and their morals. It can really shape the way session goes. And then lastly, there are a few pretty well developed religious or God-centered counseling methods or psychology studies. Some examples of these were biblical and narrative-based counseling, Christian counseling, and Christian theistic psychology. So here is where I guess my project kind of makes its way on its own, is talking about how the client-therapist relationship can serve as a model for what the individual God relationship could ideally look like. So the first one is modeling healthy attachment, just like I mentioned a couple slides back. In the same way that the therapist is able to model what healthy attachment could look like for human beings, I think it makes sense to also assert that the therapist could do this with a relationship with God as well, especially considering God is referred to with all of these human adjectives, and you know, so it makes sense that there's going to be some similar relational qualities in there, even if it's a little different because he's a spiritual being. So like I wrote here, if a person's other attachments are insecure, it's likely their attachment with God will also follow suit. So it can be really helpful, even if you're in session to address, you know, other relationships that are insecurely attached, to also consider addressing God in session. The second point here, oh, I did have one more thing I wanted to say actually about this first point. So we have, like I said, these really human roles that we often put onto God, like father and friend, but I think it's also really important to consider that what if our ideas, because of our attachment, our life experiences of what a father or a friend or something is skewed. Like, if you don't have that outside force of a therapist to help kind of course correct, you could be following the total wrong idea of what a healthy fatherly God relationship looks like, or God his friend looks like, and it could be inaccurate to what God actually intends for you in your relationship. So I think that's something that could be really helpful to discuss. So secondly is that encouragement and support for the exploration of God. So a unique thing about a therapist as opposed to like a friend or a mentor or any kind of like counsel is that the therapist is an unbiased face who's not involved in your life in any type of way. And I think that this is a really great strength to be able to discuss something like your attachment to God, because they aren't affiliated with your life, but they can still be very personal and have this serve this secure base for you to explore from and encourage you in that, without there being any swaying factors of, well, they're my pastor, so I know they want me to think this certain thing. My friend, and I know they want us to have a similar walk, or so I think that's a big plus to incorporating a therapist. And I had a question last time when I presented this back in October about, well, what if your therapist is not Christian? And this person seemed kind of bothered by the thought that a not Christian therapist could also engage with this activity. But I'd like to propose that honestly, that could even be an extra plus, because a lot of times, especially if you grow up in a religious environment, you don't realize how restricted your worldviews are to what you've been taught. So having a therapist that is unbiased and also possibly unfamiliar with a lot of your ideas can be really helpful in learning or understanding what you believe and why you believe it. And then third point I had here was the professional boundaries, which is, like I was saying before, different than a friend or a mentor, because you tell a lot of information to your therapist, but you don't necessarily learn that much about them in return. And I would say that's can kind of be compared to God, because we tell God a lot of things, but he doesn't really tell us anything back other than what's in the Bible. And maybe if he gives you a message, that's great. But usually not as talkative as your friend. So I think that's something that is really unique to the therapist aspect. And also the therapist is more tangible. So even though you still are having this focus on God, of course, I'm not saying your therapist can replace God or anything like that. You can bounce these ideas off of an actual unbiased person, where sometimes when you're trying to bounce these ideas off of God, especially if you have an insecure attachment, your mind can become very confusing place, and it can be warped by your ideas. So you think maybe God's saying something that he's maybe not necessarily saying, and a therapist can kind of suss that out. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the implications and takeaways that I think my research could be helpful for. The first is on the topic of open-mindedness. So there's this article entitled Rational Thinking as a Goal of Therapy by Barron et al. And they talk about what they call active open-mindedness. And they define that by rational thinking, which leads to more reasonableness in interpersonal context and less bias towards one's own opinions. And they say that therapy can increase this ability to do this. And to me, and also, it makes sense once you're reading the article that what they're referring to is that increased sense of security that you gain through therapy. It gives you this ability, at least they argue, and I agree, to be able to have a more fair assessment of your surroundings without that fear response of, whatever it may be that someone doesn't agree with you for whatever reason. And especially in religious circles, the disagreements can become kind of hot topics. So I think having this skill could be really, really helpful. And I think that through therapy and healing your attachment with God, that's a way to achieve this skill. And then with applying open-mindedness to attachment to God, a more secure attachment with God, like I was saying, can increase open-mindedness with other topics. So that kind of leads into my next point of church leadership, which Dr. Ko did touch on a little bit as well, but he introduced me to something that I found very surprising, which is that it's not a common practice to teach many or any at all counseling skills in seminary, which is so surprising to me because at least I've been given the impression that a big part of a pastor's job is to counsel church members. And if not the pastor, then, the other church leadership, but if they're all going through seminary, none of them are getting these proper counseling skills. So I think that my information and my research can be really helpful for one, gaining more secure pastors who are able to more charitably hear opinions outside of their own life belief or denomination or whatever it is, as well as equipping pastors and church leaders with helpful and appropriate counseling skills, and lastly, increasing active open-mindedness in the church body, which I think overall can create a more welcoming, safe place for everybody to be. So if anybody has any questions for me, I'd love to open the floor up for them.
And we have 12 minutes for questions. Any questions?
Was there a particular experience that caused you to go about this research?
Any particular thing that made me go about this research? Two things. One, I chose the combination of psych and religion because I'm a psych major and religion minor. And also they just always gone together in my mind, like just very naturally. So I just kind of followed that inclination. But also, yeah, personal experiences of church members not giving, the best counsel or not being the most open-minded, and also learning how to be more open-minded myself. I think those are all the reasons that I chose this topic.
Yeah, I really appreciate your the parallels you draw between an appropriate relationship with a counselor and appropriate relationship with God. I just looking for clarity, perhaps I missed it, but that secure, appropriate relationship, whether we're talking about a parent and a child, or a counselor and a patient, or God and all of us, right? That security and trust is not founded on always getting what we want.
Right.
And can't be, right?
Yeah, it's more about meeting those needs, because meeting your needs doesn't always mean you get what you want. Sometimes it means you get the emotional support you need, or you're given the tools to fix it yourself. So it can mean a lot of different things. It's just not being left completely on your own every single time. Right?
Any other questions? Yeah.
So if there's you have trauma with the church because you experienced something like that happened with the pastor or whatever, how would a therapist help in terms of that if there's they see the church as something that's just going to be against them?
Yeah, that makes sense. So a couple things. First, I guess it depends on the type of trauma. There's always exposure and things like that can be really helpful, like exposure work. But also I think it's possible to work with your therapist to find options that work for you, because I found another thing is that the paths that are set out for us are kind of restrictive sometimes, but it doesn't always have to be with searching for God. You could either find whether it's a certain denomination that pastor was of, you could find one that is more accommodating to your needs or your identity. But also, I think an important part of this is that through forming that healthy attachment, that doesn't mean you have to go back to church if that's not something that you want. I think the important part is healing that attachment and giving yourself the opportunity to find that out for yourself, and the therapist can be really helpful for
How about, and I think this is super interesting, but someone who doesn't mirror, secure attachment in their, kind of upbringing and secure attachment with God or with their beliefs. You know, someone who has had, the secure attachment, but does not have that in, their belief system or in God. You know, that is a very different,
Like, you mean there's a disconnect, like their childhood was secure, but their relationship with God isn't?
yes,
Well, a lot of things can impact their attachment, even though childhood is the biggest time for forming it and that sort of thing. I mean, abusive relationships can impact your attachment. It can completely change your attachment style. Other life traumatic events, like there's a lot of other factors that could go into that. Like, for example, maybe someone had a loss in their family, someone passed away, and maybe they felt led to blame that on God. That could really hurt that attachment style. So even though maybe they had a completely secure upbringing, now they've got this insecurity towards God, if that makes sense. So I think there's lots of ways that both could exist.
okay, when certain denominations are very, not, I don't know how to say it, single-minded, very, you know, specific path oriented. How does that play into your discussion?
I guess I'm kind of speaking to them a little bit, like, of ways that they should consider to open up their minds, because open-mindedness doesn't equal slippery slope thinking. Just because you're listening and accepting other people's opinions doesn't mean that you have to agree with them or act on them. And I feel like a lot of times the inclination is that just by hearing someone else's opinion or witnessing someone else's lifestyle, you're somehow gonna become that lifestyle. And I just don't think that's the case. So I guess in a way I'm kind of speaking to them. But there's also the option of, you know, switching denominations as well.
So I think of transference.
Yeah.
So like, did you see or find any research that supported, or encouraged how to navigate transference?
Yeah, I did see a good bit about transference, and especially it's included in my paper, but not in this presentation, about how the therapist has to be aware of their own attachment and how that may play a role in session, but also how, you know, their clients' behaviors may influence them, and they have to really be aware of trying to stay on that level, even path. It's definitely can be a difficult thing to do.
One question I have is, since you've noticed that like a lot of seminaries don't require counseling classes or have them, I'm just wondering, like, let's say there's a pastor who grows up and say with a fearful attachment, right? Overbearing parents, like their parents are pastors, right? And very strict and everything. And they don't encounter like these counseling, like they don't pick up any of these counseling skills in seminary. Like, what would be the outcome of that?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how aware they are, because a lot of times I've found, especially with pastors' kids, since you mentioned, I'll continue with that example. They don't like realize that they are as insecurely attached as they are, so they may think that everything is completely normal the way they're behaving. So it can be kind of dangerous depending on the advice that they're giving people. Like, if they don't see anything wrong and they are counseling these people to approach God the same way they are, and they're approaching God in a fearfully attached way, it can lead a lot of people to have wrong ideas about God, and it can be hurtful.
Any other questions? Hey, thank you very much. Wonderful.